We're trying to aim for 300K in the next couple of months. I'm a lot smaller than some of the bigger channels, but nonetheless, we have a great community going, and you know, every sub counts. We are going to play e5, which is the opening that I've been playing most commonly in the speedrun. This fourth speedrun has been all about playing classical openings and essentially taking care of the fundamentals. So we're facing the move knight c3, which is the Vienna, and we're going to respond with the traditional knight f6. This is very much still theory. Here, the Vienna Gambit is f4. Okay, we're facing the Vienna Gambit, which has become a lot more popular in recent years because of Levy's course and because of just a ton of content creators and top players have been recommending this. I have a couple of students who play the Vienna. It's totally legit. It's a good opening for 1600 level. And if you're an e5 player with black, you absolutely need to know how to respond to the Vienna. A lot of people are already confused in this position. What they're confused by is that they think that this is basically a king's gambit. The difference between the Vienna and a king's gambit is that there are these two knights on c3 and f6. What does that mean? That means accepting the Vienna is a terrible idea because white pushes the pawn up to e5, chasing the knight away from f6, and the knight has to undevelop itself on g8. So as most of you should know, black has only one move in this position that leads to a feasible position, and that is to counter-strike in the center with d5. This move makes conceptual sense because white has spent a couple of moves in the opening pushing their pawns, especially making the king a little bit more vulnerable. And the classic rule basically says that if your opponent is pushing a lot of pawns on the flank or on the side of the board, you want to counter-strike in the center. And that's exactly what we're doing. d5, f takes c5, and knight takes c4 is very common theory. And here there are two moves. Yeah, knight f3 is the old move. This is the old move, and it's a lot less common these days than queen f3, which is what Levy recommends in his course. Knight f3 is what people used to play, and it's a completely reasonable move. There's nothing terribly wrong with it, and you need to know how to respond to it if you are an e5 player. Black has several things that they can do. Obviously, we should make a developing move, and we should keep this knight on e4. We shouldn't trade on c3 unless we have to. One good option is to develop this bishop to c5, and that is the move we are going to make. What does this move do? Well, what it does is pretty obvious. We are threatening a fork with the knight on f2. We're defending the f2 square. Now, you might look at this and say, wait a second, I think this is a really dumb move because you're walking right into the move d4. You're allowing white to occupy the center with tempo and chase this bishop away. But there's a catch, because the move d4 has a serious drawback. It exposes the a5 e1 diagonal, which means we can now park our bishop on b4, violating an opening rule, which says that you should only move a piece once in the opening. But this is an extenuating circumstance because white has given us the license to do this by pushing a bunch of pawns. So fast development isn't as important here as high quality development. So by playing bishop e4, what are we doing? We're putting pressure on the knight from two different sources. We are threatening to play knight takes c3, followed by bishop takes c3. That would fork the king and the rook. And we're forcing white to defend the knight. White does not have any great ways to defend the knight. You might say, but isn't bishop d2 just a natural and good move? Bishop d2 is the best move. But then we can take that bishop with our knight. We'll have a bishop pair, and we'll be able to continue putting pressure on white's center by pushing the c-pawn up to c5. So, to my knowledge, this is the best way to equalize against the knight f3 Vienna. Now we eliminate this nice little bishop, queen takes d2. And now we need to decide how we're going to continue our development. So again, there is a couple of different things that black can do here. All of it is feasible. We can continue our development by playing a move like bishop g4. We can also put this bishop on e6, which is a somewhat more conservative way of developing, but also perfectly solid. And, of course, we can push the pawn up to c5 and put pressure on white's d4 pawn. We could have also played c5 on the previous move. Maybe that was even stronger. So let me think how I want us to play right now. I want us to play a little bit more solidly, conservatively, because that's been the sort of zen of the speedrun. I'm trying to play in a style that's very solid. A lot of you are proposing bishop f5. The reason I like bishop f5 less is because white can then develop the bishop to d3. And you might say, well, great, then that leads to a trade. But I don't want us to trade the light squared bishop because we have the bishop pair. We have two bishops, white only has one. That's called the bishop pair, and it's considered an asset in most types of positions, and this is no exception. I want us to keep both of our bishops, and so for the light squared bishop, the best prospect is to develop it to e6 or to put it on g4, which is a somewhat more aggressive developing square. Let's play bishop e6. Let's remain solid and complete our development in relatively quiet fashion. Don't forget that c5 is still very much a possible move a little bit down the line. Okay, so where should our bishop go? I think most people would be tempted to drop it back to a5 in order to keep the pin against the knight. In my experience, that is an inaccuracy. The reason is that after bishop a5, white can push the b pawn up to b4. Well, big whoop, then we can move the bishop back to b6. But once the bishop sits on b6, it is surrounded by white's pawns. And crucially, what move, who can tell me what move is so much harder to play when white's pawn sits on b4? Which critical idea that I've already mentioned is an integral part of black's eventual strategy? Yeah, c5, right? It's virtually impossible to play c5, and so we should drop our bishop back to e7. Now, you might be scratching your beard here and saying, but can't white play b4 anyway? Yes, white can play b4 anyway, but now this move no longer comes with tempo, which means it no longer carries a threat. Why is that important? Because we can try then to undermine the pawn on b4 using our own pawns. And to undermine essentially means to use your pawns to force an opponent's pawn out of a particular square. We had the classic move a7, a5. Okay, let's continue our development. We should castle. We should definitely castle, and I think our opponent is going to do the same. And now we have a major choice. We can definitely play c5. You know, I've been singing the praises of this move, but we don't have to play c5. We can also play this position without c5, and we can orient ourselves toward another pawn break that most of you are going to be very reluctant to play. What is this other pawn break that you could try to carry out? Not on this move, but I think maybe even on the next move. It's f6. Why am I even thinking about playing f6? Well, it's because white's strongest pawn is e5. e5 is hanging over us like the sword of Damocles. It's sort of, how do I like to phrase these things? The pawn on e5 is sort of interfering with the communication of black's pieces between the two flanks, right? It's controlling a couple of squares. It's clamping down on us. The pawn on e5 is clamping down on us. So what is the best way of preparing the move f6? Well, presumably it's to bring another piece. It's to develop this knight because we haven't completed our development. Where should we develop it to? Well, we shouldn't develop it to c6 because it blocks the c pawn. I still want us to reserve the right to play c5. We need to be as flexible as possible in these positions. But the second reason we want to prepare is because we want to prepare f6. And the knight obviously controls the f6 square from d7. You might say, well, doesn't this weaken the pawn on d5? It does, but white has no way of actually attacking that pawn even one more time. And even if they do, we can defend it with a move c6. We can build up a little pawn chain if necessary. So we shouldn't be worried about the pawn on d5. Okay. So hopefully those who are new to the speedrun are getting a good sense of what the speedrun looks like. This is how most games look like. I'm talking a ton, maybe too much, but I'm trying to explain the heck out of every move that I make. Knight d1. I assume our opponent is trying to bring the knight around to e3, which is a perfectly reasonable idea, but I don't think it prevents us from playing f6. I think now is a perfect opportunity to push the pawn up to f6 and try to undermine the pawn on e5, leading to a trade and maybe get the knight around to e4. Does white have to take on f6? No, obviously not. But if white does not take on f6, then we are going to take on e5. Well, what's the big deal? White can recapture, but that pawn on e5 is going to become isolated, right? It's no longer going to have the support of the d4 pawn because the d4 pawn becomes the e5 pawn. And then I'll show you after the game how we would go about attacking the pawn on e5 if white had not recaptured on f6. Or captured, I suppose. What should we take back with? Well, the two candidate moves, I think rook takes f6 is pretty awkward. So our two candidate moves are knight takes f6 and bishop takes f6. Knight takes f6 has an upside and a downside. The upside of knight takes f6 is that the knight can head for e4. And e4 is a nice centralized square. The downside of knight takes f6 is that it allows the potentially unpleasant move knight g5. How dangerous is knight g5? Well, it's not very dangerous because if knight g5, we can drop our bishop back to d7. And how can we follow up in that position? Well, we can push our pawn to h6 and try to chase the knight out of g5. But the plus side of taking with the bishop is that we're restricting the knight on f3. And the downside of taking with the bishop is that the knight on d7 is like, hey, what about me? Where are you going to put me? Well, we can keep the knight on d7, but that's a pretty passive square. I think that knight takes f6 is the most sort of ambitious is the wrong word, but I think it's the clearest path to a good position because you should always be trying to find the best squares for your pieces, and you shouldn't be afraid of moves like knight g5. A lot of players in the like 1300 level, they're really afraid of what I call one-move-itis. One-move-itis is the sort of condition of making a move just because it carries a one-move threat. Right? And moves are not made good just because they carry a threat. A lot of good moves do carry a threat, but you should never be afraid of a move simply because it carries a threat. After knight g5, we could just drop our bishop back to d7 and chase the knight away with h6. Okay, knight f2. Knight f2. And by the way, I'll answer questions after the game, so if you have uncertainties or points of confusion, please be patient. I will talk about all of them after the game. Okay, knight f2 is a great move. Our opponent is playing well. The position is fairly balanced. And in these types of boring, same pawn structure positions, the best strategy is to identify pieces that can be improved. Can we put our pieces on better squares? Well, the answer is yes. What pieces am I looking at? Well, one piece I'm looking at is this bishop on e7. I think we can reposition it to d6. Everybody should see that this is a better square. It's controlling more squares. It's also controlling the e5 square. It's discouraging white from putting a knight on e5. And it's kind of clearing the e file so that later on we can put a rook on e8 and that rook, or maybe the other rook on e8, and that rook is going to control more squares. So bishop d6 is one of those normal moves that you should be in the habit of making these types of positions. White does the same, bishop d3. Yeah, our opponent, I have to say, is playing very, very well. So I don't think that black is better here. I think the position is equal. All right, well, how do we continue? Well, I think we should continue by coordinating our rooks. One pretty straightforward move that comes to my mind is queen d7, and then bringing the rook to e8 and putting everything in the center. We can also play the move c7, c6, and try to put the queen on c7. But the problem with c6 is that white brings the rook over to e1 and attacks our bishop. And the upside of having a queen on d7 is that it defends the bishop on e6. So rook a e1 no longer comes with the threat. We can safely bring our own rook to e8. Well, c5, I have soured on the move c5 because in the worst case scenario, white can meet c5 with c3, protecting the pawn on d4. And who really benefits from that queenside tension? I don't know if it's black. I don't know if c5 is all that dangerous anymore. Rook a e1 played. We're going to do the same. We're going to bring our rook to e8. And yeah, position is totally equal. I think I have to give a lot of credit to our opponent. He's playing incredibly well so far. But this is where a lot of players in the 1700 rating range tend to make mistakes. Like, you've made a lot of the obvious moves, but will he be able to find ways to keep the tension without, making any obvious weakening moves? Do we have a long-term plan here? Not really, but you don't need one. I think plans are overrated. c3, another good move. I think we're going to do the same. We're going to play c6. What is the purpose of c6? It's to protect the pawn on d5, just making a general improving move. Also, we open up the c7 square for our queen. So in the event of knight e5, we don't actually have to take the knight anymore. We can drop our queen to the right. Yeah, the thing about such positions with an open center is that it is hard to come up with a plan. And we don't need to. Right now, we're in the phase of the game where both of us are improving our pieces. And at some point, we're going to have a confrontation, right? This is not going to go on forever. And the question is going to be, who has positioned their pieces better when, the confrontation happens, when tactics start to appear on the board and maybe a knight appears on e5. So we'll see. So far, our opponent is not playing any worse than me. I mean, he's playing at a solid master level. So far, obviously, white is playing very well. Bishop c2 is another great move. Bishop c2 is another great move. Dropping the bishop back and maybe paving the way for knight d3. Okay, so what do I want to do here? Well, what is white's strongest piece? It's not that easy to say what white's strongest piece is. But one of the annoying pieces is this bishop on c2. It's controlling a lot of light squares. Our bishop is definitely worse than white's bishop. That should be pretty obvious to you just visually. So what move comes to mind? What move comes to mind, right? On the topic of exchanging worse pieces for your opponent's better pieces, let's play bishop f5. This also starts kind of a direct confrontation because now the rooks are staring at each other and now we're starting to get tactics. Now this could fizzle out into a bunch of trades and maybe this game will end in a quick draw. Or this could start to get a little bit spicier precisely because we now have what I like to refer to as tension. I use this word very often. Tension essentially stems from pieces that are staring at each other and the potential for trades. That builds tactical tension and it creates fertile ground for, deflection tactics and other types of tactics that stem from confrontations between pieces. Okay, so what am I expecting? Rook takes c8. Yeah, I was going to say. So obviously we take back with the rook. I'm not even commenting on that. What else are we going to take back with the knight? Ugh. Right? The queen just blunders the bishop, so we just don't have a choice here. And this is going to be a tough position for me to win because look how symmetrical the pawn structure is. And with the e-file being open, rook e1 could basically exchange all of the heavy pieces. And there's a high probability that we're going to get some sort of an endgame here that I'm going to have to try to squeeze. But a lot of you might be looking at this and saying, what a boring position. This is boring. These are the types of positions that you have to know how to play. If you want to get good, you have to know how to play boring positions without doing anything dumb. And you have to develop the skill of squeezing out advantages in equal positions. That's just inevitable. And I think a lot of people have this dismissive attitude where, they're looking at a boring position. I don't really want to learn about this. If you want to be a well-rounded player, that's not the right approach. Okay, so rook e1 gives us a decision. What is the decision? Well, the decision is whether we should take the rook on e1 and trade pieces. What are the other options? We can also decline the trade. We can play rook f. If we want to keep the rooks on the board, we can play rook f8. What is the positional drawback? Who can tell me of the move rook f8? What is the drawback of declining the trade here? It gives up the file, right? It gives up the open file, although you could argue that the rook on f8 does control another open file. The f file is an open file. Just because there's minor pieces on it doesn't mean the file isn't open. An open file means there are no pawns on it. But there's the third option here that kind of appeals to me. Yeah, we can block with the knight. We can play the interesting move knight to e4, which leads to a lot of tactical tension. If knight takes e4, then we take back with a pawn and we're chilling. What bothers me about knight e4 is the possibility of queen to d3. And queen to d3 is a scary move because the rook on e8 is going to be undefended, so the knight cannot move, let alone the fact that we're going to lose our queen. But I have a couple of interesting ideas, and I think we're going to take the risk. We're going to play knight e4. Because in the resulting position, I've done some calculation, and I think that there's a high probability of white making a blunder. So we're going to go knight e4. Now, if knight takes e4, then we take back with the pawn. We're threatening the knight. Although technically, we're not threatening the knight in that position. Queen d3 is on the board. So let me show you the move that I came up with. The move that I came up with is rook to e6. And hopefully this move leads to a mistake by white. Pause, champ. I'm going to be silent for a bit, and I'm going to let people on Twitch and on YouTube just understand what makes rook e6 an annoying move for white. There is some venom to this move. That's all I'm going to say. There is some serious venom to this move. Serious venom to this move. But so far, our opponent has been unflagging, literally and figuratively. And that's a blunder. And we have a beautiful tactic here. You guys, or wait, no, this is not a blunder. Maybe it's a blunder. 1 second. I think I spoke too soon. We have a beautiful idea here, but it doesn't quite work. I missed the detail. 1 second. Let me calculate. Oh my God. This is actually really cool. I think it works. I think it works, guys. There's a gorgeous tactic here. Or does it? I'm still calculating. Just a second. No, might not work. Sag. False advertising. I missed the detail there. Let's see if we can set it up, though. Yeah, bishop takes h2 is what I had in mind. No, you guys see it. Bishop takes h2 is what I had in mind. After king h2, rook h6 check, king g1. And I thought we had rook h1. King takes h1, knight takes f2, forks the king and queen. But unfortunately, there's a knight on f2 that's guarding the h1 square. So now I'm trying to set it up. It doesn't quite work. Sorry about that. It was an honest mistake. Ooh, so then c4 is a really good move. Man, this guy's strong. So what should we do instead? Well, we can play the move g5. That's a little bit drastic. But g5 has the idea of playing g4. So that's interesting. I'm trying to set this tactic up, and I can't find a way to do it. I can't quite find a way to set up this tactic. Can he push c5? Yeah, no, I mean, rook h6. The problem with rook h6 is that there's knight takes e4. Okay, I think we're going to go for g5. As risky as this move is, it seems to me that g5 might be the best chance to bloody the water, to like, you know, muddy the waters. Sorry, bloody the waters. That's the expression's muddy the waters. So what are we doing with g5? Who can explain? Well, nobody needs to explain. It's obvious we're trying to push the pawn up to g4. We're trying to push the pawn up to g4. And what is good about pushing the pawn up to g4? Well, the knight on f3 is paralyzed because if white moves it, then the knight on f2 will be lost. Ooh, there's some amazing like ideas, but they don't quite work. They don't quite work. Okay, g4, let's go. g4 it is. Our opponent has not stopped us from advancing the pawn up to g4. This is setting up a lot of beautiful ideas. Buckle your seatbelts. Nobody go anywhere. This is going to be cool. This is going to be cool. What's the idea after knight h4? You'll see. I will keep silent. I will stay mum on it, but you'll see what the idea is. Start calculating in the meantime. If you really want to be proactive, you know, this is where, I mean, if you're watching this from YouTube, you should pause the video. And, you know, if you want to really learn from me, you should set it up on a board and start analyzing, but that's not what most people do. This is where you have to realize that white's king is now in very serious trouble. It is not well protected, and that leads me to believe that tactics, the ground is fertile for tactics, and as it turns out, there's a very simple tactic here that doesn't actually win the game on the spot, but I think it comes very, very close. What is this tactic? Does anybody see it? It's not knight takes f2. That blunders a queen. That blunders a queen. The move g3 is very tempting, but it also doesn't achieve the desired effect. Although, after hg3, you have the cool idea knight takes g3. I'll show that after the game. But as everybody is spotting, bishop takes h2 is indeed the move. Very simple clearance combination. This is pretty standard. I mean, most of you should have seen this move pretty fast. What are we doing? We're forcing the king onto h2, and then we're forking the king and knight with g3. Now, there is a gorgeous idea here that I'll show after the game. There's a gorgeous idea that leads to a better ending for black, but I think we're not going to play it because g3 leads to a winning position. As much as I want to play that other move, I'm pretty positive that g3 just ends the game. So we have to be objective. We have to be objective. And we're going to play the move g3. And I'll show you the idea after the game. Yeah, Sag, exactly. He said it 10 other times. Yeah, but that always happens. You see an idea in 10 different positions. You guys will be able to relate to this. You see the right idea in like 5 different positions, but precisely at the moment when you should have played it, that's when you missed it. What do we do now? Okay, well, perhaps some of you are attracted by queen takes f2 check. Very tempting move, but it doesn't work. Rook takes f2, g takes f2, simply king f1, and there's no follow-up. But the simplest is just gf. Yeah, gf check, king f1, and rook h6 ends the game. Notice that if a rook appears on h1, that is indeed checkmate. How do we get a rook to h1? Well, we play rook h6, right? Easy rook lift. And the greatest thing is that white can do absolutely nothing about it. Note that the f2 pawn is defended 2 different ways. So knight takes e4 does not help white. Rook h1 is made in 1. Okay, rook takes e4 doesn't help. Queen h3 blunders the queen. Queen g3 blunders the queen. And here we're not even taking the rook. We're playing rook h1. And rook e1 is checkmate on the next move. Easy. Easy. And the attack did turn out to be somewhat anticlimactic, but that's what happens very often. And there was a lot that was hidden behind the surface. So a lot to talk about. So this is indeed the Vienna defense, the Vienna game. Sorry. D5 is very important. D6 is what a lot of people default to when they don't know what to do. And D6 is a decent move, but it's, I mean, obviously black is worse. Like it's very, very passive and you don't want to go D6. There's a couple of funny lines where black plays e takes f4, white plays e5. The knight has to go back to g8, which is terrible. Now white brings the knight out to f3. If you're learning the Vienna for white, very common mistake, folks, is to play d4 in this position. The reason it's bad is because black has a check on h4. And the reason the check on h4 is dangerous is because the pawn on f4 prevents white from pushing g3. Which you have to move your king out. Is this the end of the game? No, obviously not, but you want to avoid this if possible. And it's possible to avoid this by starting with knight f3. Don't forget to play knight f3 first. And I cannot tell you how many games end with the following line. A lot of people, instead of knight g8, they play the move queen e7. They think, oh, let me pin the pawn. White plays queen e2, reinforcing the threat of e takes f6 because now the king is no longer pinned. The knight is to drop back. Again, we start with knight f3. And now tons of people play the move d6 in this position. And d6 is a logical move on the surface. You're trying to get rid of the e5 pawn. And if e takes d6, who does the queen trade favor? Well, it favors the defending side. In this case, it favors black. But d6 loses on the spot. Who can tell me what white's devastating winning move is here? Knight d5 ends the game because the queen has to stay pegged to the c7 pawn. So this gives up the queen. And after queen d8, if you want to be fancy, take on c7 first. This is the best move. This is a very pretty move. If queen c7, ed wins the queen and controls e7. And if king d7, then obviously you win the rook and black's position is in shambles. So lots of these little traps in the Vienna that people fall into because they're unaware of what to do. And so it is critical to play the move d5. If you take away one thing from this game, don't forget to play d5 in the Vienna if you're an e5 player. So f takes e5, knight takes e4 is normal. And knight f3 is an old school move. I didn't actually remember what to do against it because almost everybody nowadays plays queen f3. And I want to show everybody a line that equalizes against the Vienna pretty easily. And again, I'm sorry, Levy. I myself have students who play the Vienna with white, but, you know, it's also important to treat the other side fairly. The line that I always recommend here is a relatively little known move. Most people, they take on c3. Remember that queen h4, you might say, well, didn't I just say that this move is dangerous? Well, it's not dangerous here because white can just play g3. And knight takes g3 obviously doesn't work because the rook is defended by the queen. Or you can just play queen takes g3. So this is a dead end. Most people play knight takes c3. Nothing wrong with that move. Knight takes c3 is a totally legitimate line. It's the main line. It's the most popular move. And generally, the cool kids play d takes c3. But this position can get very dangerous for black really, really quickly. A lot of people go into this line thinking this just looks totally fine for black, and they end up losing very quickly. One particular course of action that is often taken here is bishop e7, bishop f4, castle's short, already a mistake because white castle's long, and already the pressure on d5 has become very, very dangerous. After bishop e6, there's the move c4. Hopefully you guys can see that this is no fun for black. So the line that I always recommend after queen f3 is knight c6. This already sets a trap, because you might look at this and say, wait a second, this blunders a pawn, knight takes c4. And you might think, I've understood black's idea. Black's idea is to play knight takes e5 and attack the queen, and when the queen moves, then we're going to recapture on e4. But that's wrong. Why is that wrong? Why does this position favor white? Who can tell me? Knight takes e5 is a blunder. Remember that the knight on e5 is itself undefended, so white can counterattack the queen, the knight, I apologize, by moving the queen. For example, queen g3 is a possibility, but not queen f4. Not queen f4, because the knight drops back to a defended square and black is chilling. So queen g3 or queen c3 attacks the knight, white keeps the extra piece. But the actual idea is to stick the knight on d4. To stick the knight on d4. The queen has to move. Now you might say, well, it's the same thing. I can play queen d3 and attack the knight. But after d takes e4, the queen protects the knight on d4. And white cannot take on e4 because bishop f5 skewers the queen to the c2 pawn. White is going to end up losing the rook on a1. It's not the end of the line. I know there are some complications after queen takes b7, but you can throw in the move rook b8 to prevent a bishop check on b5. Knight takes c2 check, and now white is busted. White loses the rook, and the game is over. So it is very important for white to know the move bishop b5 here. And now you get a transition into an equal endgame. Knight takes c3. B takes or D takes, the line is the same. I think Levy gives dc3. Now you throw in a check on h4, and you travel to e4, forcing the queen trade, and you get this endgame. And I've analyzed this endgame very carefully, and the position is equal. Neither side is better. So this is a very nice practical line to know with black. That's basically all you have to know. And there are tricks in this endgame as well. Countless people end up playing knight e2, bishop d7, and now the move bishop f4. And after castles, tons of people castle automatically. This is a blunder. Who can tell me why? This is a tactical pattern that I have talked about extensively on the speedrun. I've shown you plenty of examples of titled players missing this type of idea. And you have to be keenly aware of it. The move is knight takes c5. Yeah, it's easy. The move is knight takes c5. And black wins a pawn because either you give up the bishop, or after bishop d7, knight d7, black keeps the extra pawn. You might recall that I had a game many years ago where a very strong international master blundered a almost identical pattern. And I often like to show this because people don't realize how often blunders happen in real life. Here it is. This is from 2010, one of my games. As you can see, my opponent, who just played Entitled Tuesday, by the way, he's GM by now, is an Icelandic international master. And in this theoretical position, he made a new move. He thought for about 15 minutes and he played bishop g5. And of course, he blundered. A lot of you will remember this. Not knight takes e4. Knight takes e4 is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because white plays knight takes e4, f takes e4, white throws in bishop e7, and then after f takes e4, everything is fine. But the move is actually knight takes d5. Same exact concept. If white takes back, then you take the bishop, the queen defends the bishop, and black is up a pawn. And if bishop takes e7, then the same knight takes back on e7. This is what happened in the game. Or sorry, white played bishop h6 in the game. Admitting defeat, I had a clear extra pawn and I was able to win the game. Back we go to the game. In any case, this is the line that I recommend against the Vienna for black. It's this knight c6 line. In this game, our opponent played knight f3, and we made a relatively rare move, bishop c5. inducing d4, and now swinging the bishop to b4. Still a lot of games in the database. Bishop d2, knight d2, queen d2, and bishop e6, I think, is a very solid move. Very solid move. Bishop f5, I see several games in the database, but after bishop d3, as I explained during the game, I think the bishop trade favors white. What about c5 instead of knight takes d2? Yes, this is the main line. According to the database, this is the most popular move. I honestly forgot about it. So you can investigate this on your own. I think c5 is probably totally legitimate, but we decided to play more solidly. Nothing wrong with that. Bishop e6, a3, bishop e7, bishop e2. I think bishop e2 might be a little bit inaccurate. If I were white, I would probably try to put the bishop on d3, which is a more active square. But after bishop e2, we castled. And now knight d7 to prepare f6. Why not bishop a5? Well, I explained this during the game. Bishop a5 allows b4, and the bishop on b6 is imprisoned by the pawns on b4 and d4, making it harder to play c5. And again, if white plays b4 here, we have the very powerful move a5, threatening to capture the pawn. If white plays b5, then we are already capable of playing c5 if we want it. The bottom line is that our bishop is now in control of this diagonal. Also, the pawn on a3 is very weak. So who can tell me what very typical positional move should always be considered in this type of situation? This also happens in a lot of Ruy Lopez openings. Yeah, it's the move a4. And as a follow-up question, who can tell me where the knight on b8 often belongs in these types of positions? From where is the knight doing the most to put pressure on white's weak queenside squares? Yeah, b6. You will see this often in Grandmaster games. Black plays a4 to fix the pawn on a dark square so that the bishop pressures it. Bishop b2, knight d7. You put the knight on b6 for several reasons. Protect a4 and threaten to jump into c4 if white's bishop is gone from the diagonal. And notice that white's rook is totally tied down in the pawn. So you see this very often also in Ruy Lopez positions. In the anti-martial, you have actually the main line that goes exactly like that. So in the anti-martial, you have this position. Can you see the parallel? There's a pawn on b5, so white has the move a4. And in response to b4, a5 is one of white's most popular lines, and the bishop then repositions to c4. And you often see the knight moving into b3. So lots of parallels to be found in a lot of different openings. I always like to do that to help people understand that these ideas are shared between openings. So bishop e2, castles, knight d7, knight d1, f6, leading to a trade. Again, if white had refrained from trading on e5, then we would have taken ourselves. Then we would have played c6 in order to protect d5, and we would have tucked the queen away on c7 from where it attacks the e5 pawn. And in the long run, the pawn on e5 is a huge weakness. It's a huge weakness. So f6, ef6, knight f6. Why did my opponent play knight d1? Well, as was revealed in the course of the game, it was to put the knight on f2. And my guess is that later on, he wanted to bring the knight to e5. What would I have done after knight g5? Well, I would have played bishop d7. And here, our next move is going to be h6. White has a very advanced move in this position that I was worried a little bit about until I found a nice response. Basically, we're going to play h6 on the next move and force the white knight away from g5. Yeah, queen e3 worried me a little bit. This is not an easy move to play. What is the point of queen e3? Well, the point of queen e3 is prophylaxis. Prophylaxis in chess is the stopping of threats. After h6, you want to stick the knight on e6 and force a trade. And now in this position, notice that all these light squares on the king side are really weak. So after bishop d3, black is experiencing some trouble with these light squares. So what I had to find in this position, I think, is the move knight to g4. Knight to g4 is a cool move. So rook takes f8 check, queen takes f8. You're attacking the queen. White has to take. We take back. And I think here black is totally fine. We've got two bishops against two knights. And knight e6 is no longer dangerous. We can just move the queen because there's no longer a rook on f8. Yeah, queen c8 is also fine. So knight g4, I think, is a very important resource. Once I saw knight g4, I understood that this position is not dangerous. By the way, queen d3 is another nasty little move threatening rook takes f6, but here we can just play g6, which also creates a stronghold for our light squared bishop on f5. Why knight f6 instead of rook f6, asks Chris Oz. Well, rook takes f6, there's nothing inherently wrong with rook takes f6. It's a totally fine move. But the reason it looks weird to me is because it blocks the bishop. The rook could end up being vulnerable, like white can play knight e3, maybe knight g4 later. I just don't see the point. I don't really see what the rook is doing here. The bishop is kind of jailed. And both of these pieces are like, hey, I want the f6 square. And the knight needs it the most because it's the jumping off point to e4. Okay. One more question. What about knight g5 instead of knight d1? This blunders a knight because remember the queen protects g5. Does g6 weaken the dark squares? Asks Caprendo, or do you not care because no dark square bishop? Exactly. So to return to that other line, knight g5, bishop d7, queen d3, g6. Am I not worried about these squares? No, because white doesn't have the machinery to take advantage of them. And even if white did, I wouldn't be too worried about it because our king is nicely surrounded by all these pieces that can serve as defenders. Does that make sense? So back to the game. Knight f2, bishop d6 to improve the bishop. White does the same. So in this next stage, we both improve our pieces. Rook e1, rook e8, c3, c6. And the fun really starts after bishop c2. This is where the fun starts. White plays the move bishop c2. Presumably, I don't know exactly why white made this move. My guess was that he was trying to vacate the d3 square for the knight to bring the knight eventually to e5. But it's a slow move. What would I have done instead here with white? I would have done one of two things. I would have either doubled my rooks on the e file because it's really the only open file. Well, f file is also open, but it's the main center of action. And the second thing I would consider is just to play knight e5. Put the knight in the center. We would have dropped our queen over to c7 and then tried to smoke the knight out with knight d7, but the position remains approximately equal. A lot of you are asking, why didn't I play c5 here? Well, let me turn it back around on you. What does c5 do? What is the purpose? Those of you who are tempted to play c5, what exactly tempts you about this move? What does it threaten? What does it do? What are you trying to achieve? Because the way I see it, c5 no longer achieves as much as it would have used to achieve earlier because the pawn on d4 is now perfectly protected. Yeah, but white's not going to take on c5. I will concede that in this situation, our bishop is improved. Although, of course, there's also a drawback. The d5 pawn is isolated, but white doesn't have to take. And remember this, right? Chess isn't checkers. You don't have to capture anything, and you can never assume that your opponent is just going to agree to the trade just because a trade benefits you. White can just continue on with his business. Yeah, you can push c4, but big whoop. What does this accomplish? This just hems in the bishop, right? And if you play CD, who does this favor? Well, probably not black. You know, I don't see why this favors black. Not to mention that white can play knight takes d4 and blockade the IQP. Now, just because a lot of people do automatically trade doesn't mean you can make that assumption. c6, bishop c2, and bishop f5. So rook takes c8, rook takes c8, I think is already not a mistake. But I think already the situation becomes a little bit tense for white. So takes, rook e1. And I think if we would have traded, this would have been a draw. This is just a dead draw. The problem is that queen c2, which I was tempted by initially, fails to queen e6 check, which is very, very annoying. So for that reason, we decided to spice things up with knight e4. And after queen d3, I think rook e6 is the cog that makes the machine go. Without this rook e6 move, none of what we did subsequently would have worked. How did I find the move rook e6, and why is it such a good move? Well, I did some reverse engineering, and I realized that what is the key indicator of the health of black's position? Well, it's whether we can preserve the knight on e4, and whether we can always guarantee that in response to knight takes e4, we can recapture with the pawn. The problem is that the rook on e8 is not only undefended, but anytime we move the knight, white takes on e8 with check. That's a huge tactical asset. So that's the main thing I wanted to solve. And we solve it by putting the rook on e6 because this kills two birds with one stone. We're also preparing to lift our rook to h6 How do I know that that's good? Well, I'm seeing that the bishop is aiming at h2. And if the knight on f3 moves away, I realized that h2 was going to be a serious weakness. Why was the bishop pair, asks Human FTW, suddenly not an asset worth keeping? Yeah, well, I think the situation changed because our light squared bishop kind of ended up being pretty lame here. And to me, the importance of trading off our opponent's strongest piece outweighed the importance of keeping the bishop pair alive. So it's just a more concrete consideration. So after rook e6, white plays the move c4. I was very attracted to the move bishop takes h2 check. At first, I thought it was winning. Why did I think so? Well, after king takes h2, you get a really interesting position. Now, at first, you might say, wait a second, the knight is hanging. But the queen is hanging. We can't play knight takes f2. I thought we had the move rook h6 check, and there's a beautiful detail here. Originally, I believed that king g1 lost to rook h1. As it turns out, that was the blunder that I made. And I thought that knight h3 was forced. Who can find the gorgeous winning sequence for black here? Here, black actually is winning, and this is what excited me initially. There's a beautiful idea here. Who can spot it? If you're watching on YouTube, pause the video. Yeah, you can start with queen f4, but even more elegant, start with rook takes h3 check. G takes h3, and now the critical check on f4. If the king moves back to h1, fork time on f2. Also notice, the line doesn't end here. You have to make sure that the check doesn't give anything, but it doesn't because we have the f7 square, no forks. Black is up a queen. And if king g1, then we slide the queen into g3, and it's checkmate whichever way the king goes. If king f1, queen f2. If king h1, knight f2 is mate. Of course, you can also start with queen f4. But the great thing about starting with rook h3, the reason it's actually better than starting with queen f4 is that after king g1, there's another very pretty tactic. Classic idea, rook h1 check, deflection, knight f2 picks up the queen. So for this reason, white has to play king g1. And now I thought rook h1 still worked. I forgot that the knight can just capture. From a distance, I thought king h1 was forced, and now knight takes f2 wins. And so I had to think on my feet. And that's where I came up with the move g5, which should be perfectly logical to you if you've been listening. Because what is the entry point to white's king? The entry point is h2 or f2. And the move g4 satisfies both of these qualities. It, weakens the f2 square, and it also weakens the h2 by forcing the knight out of f3. Rook e2, g4. It is a tough move to make because I can hear a lot of you saying, but doesn't it weaken the king side? Yes, but white is almost out of pieces, right? White is almost out of pieces. It's like, I don't know what to compare it to. But it's like, walking around. I previously people found this to be funny. I compared it to like walking around in your apartment, with your clothes off. It's like, oh my God, that's so uncivilized. But if there's nobody around, like, who gives a shit? Like you can spend 3 hours in the morning just like, walk around with no pants on. It's become very popular in the age of Zoom. Same thing. Like, aren't you opening up your king? Well, there's nobody around to exploit it. There's nobody around to actually attack the king. So g5 is a move you can make with a clean conscience. What should white have done? I don't know. I don't actually know what the best move was. According to the engine, the only way to equalize was CD, knight takes e4, girl. And after d4, queen c4 equalizes because you cannot take on f3. You drop e6 with check. So black's best move here is to move the king out of the pin so that you can move the rook. And now white has to find another accurate move, d5. Very difficult move. What is the purpose of d5? Well, if the rook moves to h6, then you drop the e4 pawn, and g4 is impossible. So you have to stay. Oh my God, the best line. Okay, rook e7, knight d4. And the knight moves into e6 with a very unclear position. It's equal according to the engine. Because we have this monster battery. White has a monster knight on e6. It's zeros according to the engine. But this is very hard to find. I mean, just even playing this move is really difficult. Because your brain is like, I can't take on e4. I get forked. And yet you have to be concrete. So instead, rook e2 already is not losing. After g4, white had one more chance to keep the balance. This is still equal. So white has to play CD, and knight e5. Only move. Only move. Oh, and this is so cool. What is the reason? Sorry. What is the reason that white has to play CD first? What is the reason? The reason is that after the immediate knight e5, black has rook takes e5, d e5, and bishop c5 with unstoppable pressure on the knight on f2. And the difference maker is that after CD knight e5, if you try to do the same thing, whereas Waldo, the difference is that queen takes d5 check is devastating. So in that first line, the pawn on d5 was protected. And after knight e5, black has to resort to bishop e5, de, rook e5, but after knight e4, it appears that white makes a draw even though he's down a pawn. Rook e4, de e4. Of course, white is worse, but according to the engine, there's enough counterplay against black's king to make a draw. So apparently g5 does black bite in the you-know-what. I mean, this is tactical detail that's very difficult. Knight e5 is a hard move to play. Our opponent was not sensing the danger, and after bishop takes h2 check, the game is over. Last key point that I wanted to make. There is a beautiful idea I implied during the game. What was it? The gorgeous idea was rook h6, king g1, and now who can find the combination? At this point, you have to go for the line. If you give a check on h6, you have no choice. There's a really lovely idea, and I would call it the Petrosian-Spassky idea. This is a theme which you should recognize from a couple of famous games if you've done your puzzle solving. And I will show you exactly which game this reminds me of the most. So Petrosian-Spassky from their World Championship match in 1966, this position occurred on the board. White is down in exchange, and here Petrosian initiates a gorgeous combination. It starts with rook takes f4 and bishop e6 check. Black has to block with a rook, otherwise black is checkmated. Rook f7, knight comes into e4, stopping the black queen from entering the game via g5. Spassky tries queen h4, now knight takes d6, queen g5 check, king h1, and rook a7. This is the critical position. A lot of you should recognize this game. This is super famous. Bishop f7, rook f7, and now knight takes f7, which is totally unconvincing due to queen takes e3, but queen h8 check, the final move of the game, very famous move. And Spassky resigned because it forces the king onto h8, and now you pick up both of these pieces and you have an extra piece in the end. So this theme is surprisingly common in a lot of different combinations. And you can trace this theme here. Queen takes f2, rook takes f2, rook h1, force the king onto h1, and now do the Spassky thing. Do the Petrosian thing. And black is up a pawn and should be winning here. But it's very important not to play to paint pictures, but to play to win games. And g3 is so much easier. G3 is so much easier. Yeah, the whole line is forced. As you can see, white literally has only one response to each of these things. But g3 is so much easier. Gf and rook h6 just leads to checkmate. And I have to prioritize, objective value over beauty. So, yeah, nothing white can do here. The best move, according to the engine, is queen h3, and it's mate in 7. So, at this point, the game is over after g3. Yeah, you can't. King takes g3 is illegal. The knight defends the pawn, and that is that. 20 or 30 moves. It was a nice game. A lot of stuff behind the scenes. So, as I explained, just as a takeaway, first of all, if you're an e5 player, remember d5 in the Vienna. Remember that in boring positions, you want to try not to self-destruct. You want to try to make incremental improving moves, right? f6 to undermine the pawn, improving the bishop, improving the queen, the rook, solidifying the pawn structure, trading off your worst piece for white's best piece, and then understanding when an opportunity has occurred, which you can step on the gas pedal. This is where we stepped on the gas pedal, and hopefully the rest of my moves were understandable. Kudos to our opponent. He played very well. It was not an easy game. And I hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for hanging out. See you guys later tonight. Bye.